the beginning of this week, we'll be studying Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another romantic critic, and who is having a name to himself as the critic who, for the first time, segregated the term imagination into different components. So, Coleridge, who is known for his introduction of supernatural elements into poetry, is representing the idea of imagination by telling that fancy and imagination were two distinct and widely different faculties. So, at the very beginning, he is very assertive in thinking that fancy and imagination were two distinct and widely different faculties. And he is telling, if we look at the source, the Greek translation or the from Greek word fantasia and the Latin word imaginatio, the term imagination and fancy are being derived. Then he is telling that if we look at the history of English poetry, he found that Milton had a highly imaginative and Cowley a very fanciful mind. So, in his distinction between imagination and fancy, he wants to relate it through the examples of Milton and Cowley. And he is telling that he wants to establish this distinction through certain argument. But before that, he wants to remind the reader about his partner, William Wordsworth, and his concepts of poetry, imagination, poet, etc., from which he wants to differ. So, he is telling that the explanation which Mr. Wordsworth has himself given will be found to differ from mine, chiefly, perhaps as our objects are different. It could scarcely indeed happen otherwise from the advantage I have enjoyed of frequent conversation with him on a subject to which a poem of his own first directed my attention. So he is telling that object of poetry for Wordsworth and him are different. It was Mr. Wordsworth's purpose to consider the influences of fancy and imagination as they are manifested in poetry, and from the different effects to conclude their diversity in kind. So, what is the difference between Wordsworth and Coleridge, according to Coleridge, in their excuse me, objective of poetry? So, he is telling Wordsworth's objective of poetry is about the influence of fancy and imagination, and the different effects they have on poetry. It is diversity in kind. They are different in kind. But it is my object to investigate the seminal principle and then from the kind to deduce the degree. But in case of Coleridge, the difference between fancy and imagination is in degree. So, in this way, he is first making a distinction between fancy and imagination by referring to the poet, brings out the difference between fancy and imagination in kind, and in his poetry, it is in degree. Then he is proceeding by telling that I would arrange under the different senses and powers as the eye, the ear, the touch, etc., the imitative power, voluntary and automatic, the imagination or shaping and modifying power, the fancy or the aggregative and associative power. So, how he is differentiating between fancy and imagination in degrees? So, he is telling that to him, the imitative power in both the cases, and particularly in imagination, is voluntary and automatic. Remember, in case of imagination, the imitative power is voluntary and automatic, and it is also shaping and modifying. It shapes, it gives a shape out of certain vague arrangements of sense impressions, and it also is modifying, it also modifies whatever impressions are collected under imagination. They are being modified from the reception to expression, whereas the fancy represents the imitation in an aggregative and associative power. It is an aggregative. That means it simply makes a collection of the impressions together without having the power of shaping or modifying. And it is an associative power. It is not a power of transformation. It is not a power of what you can say modification, but it is a power of association. So, in this way, he is drawing the basic difference. It can be asked for objective question of 2 marks, and that the understanding or the regulative, substantiating and realizing power. The imagination is the power of understanding or regulative. Through imagination, we try to understand the impressions we receive, or it regulates. It regulates the function of our senses through the impressions. On the other hand, the fancy is substantiating and realizing. It substantiates whatever impressions are created, they are being substantiated. And it is a speculative reason. So, it is speculative. In this way, he is elaborating the difference between fancy and imagination. Again, further elaborating that, he is telling that imagination can be the power by which we produce or aim to produce unity, necessity, and universality in all our knowledge by means of principles a priori, So, in this way, imagination aims at producing unity among all the impressions we have received and bringing out a sense of universality in our knowledge. On the other hand, fancy is aggregative and associative, and in both cases, it is inspired by the moral will and the choice. So, whether it is fancy or imagination, there is a moral will and the choice on the part of the poet. The imagination is again the sensation of volition, voluntary. Volition means voluntary. It is a voluntary sensation which have risen to include under the head of single and double touch. That means he is telling imagination is a voluntary sensation which can be divided into single or double touch. That means even imagination can also be divided into two groups. Here again, in page 153, he is talking about Mr. Wordsworth's objection is only that the definition is too general. To aggregate and to associate, to evoke and to combine belong as well to the imagination as to the fancy. But he is telling all his ideas are being objected to by Wordsworth by telling that this definition of Coleridge is simply very general. It cannot establish much. Therefore, he is telling, I replied that if by the power of evoking and combining Mr. Wordsworth means the same as and no more than I meant by the aggregative and associative, I continue to deny that it belongs at all to the imagination, and I am disposed to conjecture that he has mistaken the co-presence of fancy with imagination for the operation of the latter singly. But Coleridge is telling probably Wordsworth means the same thing between the power of evoking and combining and the power of aggregation and association. Probably these two groups are having same meaning to Wordsworth, and if it is that, then fancy and imagination are co-present. Anyway, now Coleridge is coming to give a proper definition to his theory. So, in the last paragraph of 153 page, he is telling the imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. That means he is telling that imagination is also being grouped into primary and secondary. And what is primary imagination? He is telling that primary imagination is there with every person. It is universal. Remember, primary imagination is universal. It is a living power. It is a living power. That means which is living and which is self modifying at every moment, as life is modifying itself every moment. So, primary imagination is also a living power which is being modified every moment. It is the prime agent of all human perception. All human perception, whatever we see in life, how we look at life, That is primary imagination. And as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation. And it is also a repetition in the finite mind. Imagination, already he told that it is a living power, it is continuously modifying. But at the same time, he is telling where it is continuously modifying. It is continuously modifying in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation. That there is a finiteness, and within that finiteness, the primary imagination is continuously modifying our perception. For example, if we look around us, what we found? We found the horizon everywhere. Suppose you are staying in a village or in a very open place where there is no big structures, and you are looking around, you are finding the horizon everywhere. There may be the hills at one end, there may be the sea or a river, there may be the forest, but everywhere the horizon is, the sky is meeting some manifestation of the earth. So, this is the finite mind. Every day we wake up, we find this is the world where I live. But within that finite world, suppose every day I will wake up and I will find the same thing, what will happen? I won't like to wake up one fine morning because I am damn bored to look at the same thing. So every morning when we wake up, why we wake up? Because we find there's some change, we find some novelty, we find some modification. So that is the primary imagination. Every morning we wake up, we think this is a new day, this is a new beginning, this is a new world. So this is primary imagination. The secondary imagination I consider as an echo of the former. So what is secondary imagination? The secondary imagination is an echo of the primary. It is coexisting with the conscious will. The secondary imagination is coexisting with the will. There is a subtle difference now emerging. The primary imagination is having a sense of permanence, and the contrast between, or the coexistence between, modification, newness, novelty, and the permanence. And it is everywhere present with every man. But the secondary imagination is having a conscious will. Every person is not having the secondary imagination. Who is having a consciousness beyond the ordinary reality is having a secondary imagination. So the poet, the artist, the philosopher, they are having a conscious mind, and if they will, they can develop that imagination. Yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency and differing only in degree. And he is telling there is only a degree of difference between the primary and secondary imagination. Otherwise, they are identical in their primary nature. And in the mode of its operation, it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. So, it is a recreative power. The primary imagination is a creative power. What it does? It is a collective power. It collects all the impressions around in our life. Suppose, for example, some of us have traveled much, and in their mind, they have different types of objects and their impressions collected. We have in our mind impressions about different hills, different rivers, different plants, different birds, etc. etc. So the primary imagination collects all these impressions and stores it by categorizing it. There is a room for hills, there is a room for trees, there is a room for rivers. And now you look, suppose you are having in your mind or your idea 10 types of hills already you have impressions collected from your travel, but still you are traveling. How you are traveling? Because you want to discover something new in the permanent world. So you are collecting number 11 impression about the hill, number 12 impression about the hill. But primary imagination, its function is up to that. It gets the impressions, it stores in the mind, and it segregates those impressions into different categories. But the secondary imagination, what it does, it operates by dissolving, diffusing, dissipating. All these different impressions are being dissolved. Suppose you are having in your mind impressions about 10 types of hills, from the red earth hill of Arunachal to the old stone hills of South India or the rugged hills of Africa. Then your idea came that you want to a painting of natural scenario. What you will do? Will you paint a particular hill, either of Arunachal or Himalayas or of South India or anything? No. You are drawing all these 10 impressions together by dissolving them and bringing out an idealistic hill, isn't it? Similarly, when you are creating an impression about the river, your river is not Dulani, your river is not Beki, your river is not any particular river, but a total impression of all the rivers, their impressions in your mind. So, how you have achieved it? By dissolving different impressions. So, the secondary imagination is a recreative imagination. It recreates through dissolving, diffusing, dissipating in order to recreate. Or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. As I told you, that in their dissolution of different impressions, in dissipating different impressions to create one impression that idealizes. Why? Again, going back to Aristotle, Aristotle said that the poet imitates the nature, but what he imitates? He imitates the ideal in the nature. A hill is broken by the road contractor for the stone by establishing a stone quarry, but a student will never draw that hill. The student will draw an ideal hill. So, in this way, he is telling the secondary imagination dissolves all those impressions collected in the mind by the first imagination, and it will idealize to unify. Therefore, it is essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. So, he is telling that the primary imagination is creative, secondary imagination is recreative. Yes, here creative means You are not creating anything new. You are simply segregating the already collected impressions, and recreation means you are recreating something out of all the different impressions through unification and idealization. And then Coleridge is coming to elaborate about fancy. He is telling that fancy, on the contrary, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space. But fancy has no recreative or creative power. It is only fixities and definites. What is there is there. You can't improve upon. You can't even segregate. For a better example, I will give you the example of a mannequin in the fancy store where you are going to purchase a piece of fashionable cloth, and you are struck by the mannequin wearing a particular set of cloth. In its totality, it attracts you, and you want that this cloth I will purchase, this piece of dress I will purchase because it is attractive. But what happens? Suppose the shopkeeper will say, okay, I can give you this particular dress, and you took the dress. But when you took the dress and put it on, you found no, it is not that attractive as it was being there. Why? Because in the mannequin, there were some other extra features like a hat or a handbag or the shoe. The totality was attractive. But when you took the dress, it may not be attractive. So what happened? It was a fixed impression. Fancy is a fixed impression, and it is like a mode of memory. You looked at a thing, you remembered that, you came back home and you demanded to your parents that I want that particular suit, I want that particular pair of jeans, and this is a mode of memory. The impression in the memory, which is fixed, slightly different from that, you won't accept. Suppose the shopkeeper will say, no, sir, I don't have that particular pair of jeans, but I have another pair of jeans. You may not appreciate it. Therefore, he is telling fancy is a memory fixed in space and time, while it is blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will, which we express by the word choice. So, fancy is a choice controlled by particular memory in a particular space and in a particular time that may not be suitable in another time or another space. So, unlike imagination, it has severe limitations. But equally with the ordinary memory, it must receive all its materials ready made from the law of association. But it also, fancy also, receives the impressions of life like the primary imagination. But they are all ready made, they are all prepared, fixed from the law of association. You can't separate. In your drawing of a natural scene, you may present the hill from South India, the river from Arunachal, the tree from Kashmir, the birds from Madhya Pradesh, the tiger from Bengal. That is your unity. But in fancy, you can do that. Whatever total impression you have got in one place, that will be there. You cannot break it down. You cannot create a new whole. You cannot create a new unity. So that is the difference between fancy and imagination. As Coleridge has elaborated. I think you have properly been able to understand that. So, this is for today. We will discuss his other ideas of genius, poetry, and poet the next time.